I appreciate everybody joining us today. It looks like quite a few people are logging in now. I want to welcome you to our monthly webinar, and today is on inventory. And we're trying to kind of go two different levels of seminars. One is kind of like cross detail functionality, and then we're also trying to cover a broad number of things from cover the whole module to what does the module cover. So today it's meant to go over the big picture as to inventory and some different things on that. Daniel, are you have the ability to keep allowing people in? Can you do that?
Yeah, I'll take care of that.
Okay, thank you. So inventory, myself, Claire Donald Rasmussen. I always add my middle name, so just in case people forget that Claire is a unique name. But I am the person that created most of the program, not all of the program. I've had several other people that have contributed, and I've been working on it for over 20 years. And so I want to dive into some of what we've done and why we've done it, and give you some information. And at the end, we'll allow you to do some questions as well. So let's proceed. So introduction, history of what we've done, purpose, some options, setup, and methods. And then we're going to get into just some question and answer at the end of that as well. So I will stop at different times in the presentation and give you 30 seconds to a minute to throw out some questions as we go over things. So I'll throw that in there. Inventory management is the core to our program. There's nothing else that is like more centric to our program. We talked last month about manufacturing and how that is core, but it is still secondary to inventory. The items in inventory, we organize, we track, we sell, we buy, build. That they all require items. Items is the default word that we use as a definition for an inventory unit. So some people call them SKUs, some people call them part numbers, we call them items. The main reason we call them items is because you could have things that are non-inventory or non-part based. And so that's why we didn't want to keep it pigeonholed just to part numbers. Our focus is manufacturing businesses, but other companies or a lot of businesses, they do a mixture of things. And maybe they're doing distribution as well, or they're doing reselling. So all those things are core with the inventory as well. So there's just so much to talk about today. I'll probably fill the entire hour, except for some question and answer time. Item numbers, old school, 30 some years ago when I got into this, actually closer to 40, but 35 years ago when I got into it, the item number was the important thing. You had to have an intelligent part number system. You had to have all your logic based into it. You got to have thickness and weight, or all these informational attributes in that one field, or the description had to contain a lot of it. That's changed over time just because we have so many more fields. We have other size and units of measure field. And units of measure is probably the second or third most important field to use in the database and to have that accurate. We have lots of different grouping fields in the database related to inventory or ways to organize your data. There's reference fields, things that you can reference, like what barcode number to use, or a user-defined sort, things like that. Linking fields, an example of those would be like customers or vendors, things that you want to say, this item is linked to that, or it's linked to something else. We do have tracking fields where you can track information. You can turn on or off tracking. Costing. We have standard cost. We have average cost. Under standard cost, it's broken into many different subcomponents of a standard cost. More later, we're going to talk about the different costing methods. We have pricing. I believe we're up to 7 different methods that you can put in a price structure for your customer, and so that it can auto-populate, and all those are based, not all, but most of them are based off the item number or the inventory item. Of course, there's the connection to accounting with GL accounts and stuff. And then there's just little history, be it transactions or your informational history, notes on it. There's so many things, and we just keep our history with the inventory module is we keep adding. And sometimes now this is the present day screen, and it's many more fields than what we started with 20 years ago. And some of that's really good. We even debated in our design meeting earlier this week as to maybe if we could make it simpler sometimes, that you could hide fields and things like that. So that's something we'll look into in the future. Not available yet. We'll look into it. But there's a lot of tabs off of the inventory when you're looking at an item. So, there's model numbers. But the key here is there's only 4 to 6 that are required. The item number, the description, item type. You define that item type, manufacturer type. Those are the 4 that are required. I really recommend the stock unit of measure, even though it's not required, I really recommend that. And then we do ask you put in some GL placeholders on some of those. Purpose. We all come into needing an accounting or inventory or order management system with different purposes. And I really would challenge you as you use or look into our program, even if you've already been using our program, revisit sometimes the purpose, because it'll kind of prioritize or help you decide how or what to use in the program. So basic questions like, how many do you have? The old quantity on hand. I need to know what we got in stock. What's the value of what we have? Very important to those accounting folks. Hey, we've got to reconcile the GL to what we have in inventory. Much does something cost? What's a costing information that can happen? Where do we get it from? That's like linking it to the vendor. When did we sell it last? How many did we sell? How many should we buy? What's the latest revision, or where do we use it on other products or things like that? So try to boil it down to what your purpose is in the inventory. Bottom line is we can record a lot of information about inventory. We can do lots of transactions, and every transaction has a cost, or putting that data into the system. We try to minimize that for you, but the more you put into the system, the more you can get out, but there's a balance there. And so we want you to really challenge what you use it for, and so then we can help determine how you use it. There's an options screen. Again, under defaults, your options tab, there's all these true and false checkbox. One I'm going to point out because there's a lot to go over. I won't go over all of them. Just emphasize one is the prevent negative quantity transactions. You would say, well, duh, but sometimes that creates extra work for yourself. So if the inventory was off quantity and it prevents you from creating an invoice or shipping something out, so it's a choice. But so there's different options that we've added over time. Some are customer specific. The particular Techno Resource customers said, hey, can you make it do this? Like Daniel pointed out one that we did for the Petrosmith, the company he worked with, on allowing non-inventory transfer. we may get rid of that because I don't know why we'd ever allow that. But no, there's some are very specific, but like quantity on hand or preventing a negative quantity transaction. My first system I worked on 35 years ago, it wouldn't allow you to do negatives. Well, then I'd get some users that got very creative at manipulating the system and kind of messed things up more sometimes because they just wanted to fix it quick so they could process transactions, and it added more garbage to the data. So, but there is settings as to how we use the system. But a lot of these are more just allow this or prompt this, that kind of thing. More setup questions, what part numbering system, we do have a next part number. If you guys haven't seen that in the system, when you do a new, you'll always see it pop up with a next number. And most of the time you're replacing it with something else. Well, there is a default under default to your company under next number down here for item. And it just says, well, when we say new, it's going to come up with 1, 2, 3 next. And you can set those. And that's appropriate for across the whole system and a lot of different other fields as well. But a lot of times we're overriding that. And sometimes I'll use what the vendor called it, or, but you probably already have some part number scheme that you use. So you just have to replace that. But that's something that you need to make some decisions, and it's good to be somewhat organized. As much as you've got all these other fields that you can utilize, it's good that if you're consistent with how you're describing things. Multiple warehouses. We require one warehouse in the system, but if you can have one physical location and actually have more than one. One example we came up recently was we had to have a WIP warehouse or work in process versus our stores, or so we could separate activity. But typically, if you're one location, you really only need the one warehouse, and that's to your benefit. It saves you transactions. Other companies that have multiple warehouses, you have to transfer, you have to move inventory between warehouses, and that takes transactions and effort. Costing method, I'm going to get into that. And then tracking, that's a big one. Am I required to do lot or serial tracking? Because it adds a level of detail on all your activity. Building blocks. When you're implementing the inventory system, you need to have some information set up in advance. Not all of these things do you have to have set up in advance, but they build on each other. And so just as we talked about warehouses, you have to have the one primary warehouse that defaults. You need to have GL accounts just as placeholders, even if you're not using the accounting system. Units of measure, again, we let you define those, and we let you create a list of those. When you're in the system, you can go under the inventory other. Remember, a lot of our setup stuff is under the other menu. And so we have units of measure, and you create that list to define it in the language you use to describe something. And then that'll print out on different forms and things and screens as you deem necessary. But on the building blocks, there's certain ones that you set up. There's 2 on here that I've highlighted in orange, that those are program specific, so you don't get to change those. One is status and one is manufacturing types. We've touched on manufacturing types in the past, like with the purchasing module, the manufacturing module, because when you're defining inventory, you have to tell me what kind of an item it is. And so those you don't get to choose because the program acts differently when we pick that. But item types, you can call them whatever you want. Resources, that's like more if it's a production item. You have to add these different things because all these different building blocks are like drop downs are available in the item or inventory module. We mentioned vendors and customers already. Attributes, have a whole nother webinar just on attributes. Bin locations, like how am I going to organize my warehouse? Don't have to use that, but it's something you can. Cycle counts and multiplier groups. So even though the item is the core, sometimes they're still set up, or there's lists that you need to create before we get into like really populating the inventory data. I'm going to show a couple. Oh, I wanted to go over the tied to accounting. And because most people do use our accounting system as well, the GL account is assigned to the item type that defaults to the item. And then that affects when we do a transaction for an item, it uses whatever that item's GL accounts are plus the defaults to what the GL accounts it use. So that's the linkage from inventory to accounting is that diagram. Costing, a whole nother topic. We have the option of standard or weighted average costing or weighted rolling average cost. You assign that in the item type screen. So when you're defining an item type under other, again, that's where most of our building blocks are set up. You can go into the item, and that's where we're telling it what is the costing method. And so you can have a mixture of two. Sometimes that's appropriate, but generally we recommend the weighted average. And that's because the system is constantly updating it for you based on transactions. Standard costing requires someone to either perform utilities on the system or to go and actually record what the standard value is for each product. So it takes some more maintenance on it. The best environment that is when you use a little bit of both. You use the weighted average costing for the accounting, and you use the standard as a benchmark. So that's what when you're really getting going on the system, we kind of recommend you use both as a comparison. I'm going to go through the different things real briefly off of the module just to give you a brief discussion. I'm going to stop and ask questions for any questions before that. You'd have to unmute yourself before you ask a question. So I'll give 30 seconds for somebody to interrupt here. Okay, we'll wait till the end. So off of the inventory menu, we've got the items list that's consistent with our items list. Remember how I said you can look up by many different fields? Don't forget this search box right here. Don't forget you can use that to search this entire list. And then we give you other search functions to get to find those different items. Especially when you get up in the 20 to 40,000 items, it's really important to have good searching capacity there. So inventory items, again, from the items list, remember you have all your right-click functionality. The main one to remember for an inventory is item or status inquiry. And that one is the transact is to be able to show you kind of the status or what's the information about this item. And it's a pivotal like starting point to looking up information on that item. What do we have? What do we have quantity on hand by warehouse? What's currently on PO by warehouse? Just different information. There's also some clues on this one. I give you pluses and minuses in front of these as to determine the available quantity down below. So if you're saying, how do you calculate the available calculation? Look right there at those pluses and minuses, and that's what, and the ones that don't have a plus and minus, those are not factored into this available number at the bottom. But you can find out lots of information here. You can even click on the history to see what the transactions are, when they were, how it affected the warehouse and quantity, things like that. And one recommendation is to always remember to maybe look at the create date as to when that transaction was created, because sometimes things will be done out of order, even though you dated it the wrong date. So just a little tip there is to look at that create date field. You can do to where used to see, where this is used on another assembly. And you can look at current transactions, what's on PO, what's currently on manufacturer or on sales order. So the status screen just gives you a huge jumping off point to look up information, even to the point of usage. So you could look at what's been used over so many months, or you can look at the bill of materials. There's just a lot of information you can find from here. Even like serial control, you can look up what's the current items and what's the serials numbers that are in stock. So you'll find that the item status screen is probably the most popular or the most utilized screen within the program. Further down the menus, there's transfers. If you're not using multiple warehouses, good on you. You don't have to use transfers, but the transfers is the function that moves material between one and another warehouse. Physical counts, that just gives you the ability to freeze inventory as of a current thing and gives you some time to get the quantities that you counted into the system. Adjustments, as good as we do, you'll always have adjustments. And in a perfect world, you never would. But whether you scrap things, whether you lose things, whether you have to make adjustments and say correcting a quantity on hand, and that can be done both with the physical count or with adjustments. Tracking, we talked about that briefly. We have lot control, serial control. We even give you the ability to enter warranty information. If you never looked at that, if you sell major components or tools or things you want to look at, you can start to take, this was written so somebody turned in a warranty card or filled out a web form and you could record it directly in the system, even if it's not, if it's sold through a distributor. And then there's some additional linkage there under tracking. The other menu we talked about, that is part of the building blocks. So you have attributes, drawings, serial attributes, cycle counts. Those are the making up what codes they are. Item types we've already mentioned. Multiplier groups, that's meant for the pricing structure. So if you have something that belongs to a group that maybe gets a discount, that's part of a group of items that gets discounted together. And then the units of measure, again, we've talked about drawing types as a way to organize drawings. Warehouses, again, we've mentioned. Chained items. This one's almost better to describe it in if we were talking about the sales module, but it's if one item gets sold with another item, you can chain them together. That's what that's for. Sales category, that's just groupings. Attributes, again, they're bin locations if you want to predetermine bins or look at a list of bins. And then warranty attributes, adjustment reasons. A customer had us add that, or user had us add that just so we could have a drop down, and that made it easier for like quality reporting. Buying method, that is meant to say, hey, this is how we purchase this item. So it's a categorization, organizational field that you can do. Have all kinds of utilities that you can do, merging, updating, costing, things like that. We have our standard information like queries, charts, totals, history we talked about briefly. quantity on hand. So that's just a simple, hey, what is our current quantity on hand for all our items and per warehouse? Okay, so that's kind of a brief, a very, very brief description of the menu structure. And remember, a lot of this stuff, because it's a core thing, it will relate to a lot of other places in the program from that standpoint. Back to here. Daniel, did I already describe the costing? I don't think I did. Method.
You went over at least part of it.
It goes into the positive. When you do a positive quantity, you increase the quantity on hand. That's when the average cost will change. So here's the formula: current quantity times current average plus the transaction quantity times the transaction cost divided by both quantities. There's a couple of things if you're fun with math. If the current quantity is 0, the new transaction cost or the average cost will now equal whatever the new transaction is. Okay, pretty straightforward, but it just, so it's not a historical average, meaning it's not continually averaging from the beginning of time. Every time you get hit 0, it kind of resets to the new activity. And sometimes accounting system will call it a rolling because it'll keep changing as it goes forward. And one thing Daniel likes to mention to people is it's also the weighted part of the description because it's based on the quantity and it's quantity times the cost. It's just not averaging the cost. It's kind of taking into account how much quantity was part of the transaction. So that's how the costing of weighted average is calculated. Here's a diagram that I typically will use in our training and our discussion, and it's all the different transactions that move inventory from, let's say, vendors all the way through customers. And one important note is inventory can be both raw materials or purchased items, and it can be finished goods or sub-assemblies. And I just did this for a showing of progression across, left to right. But the receiving of the PO, not the PO itself, changes the quantity on hand. The purchase order, being on purchase order, changes the available. So you want to make sure you understand the difference between available on our system and the current quantity on hand, because it can be the same number in rare cases, but it can be very different. And so you want to make sure you understand that the available is it's all those pluses and minuses from the status screen. So it's taking into account what's going to come in, not just what is in stock today. So a received PO brings it into our system. If you issue it to the work order, that takes it out of the quantity on hand. And if you do a manufacturing receipt, that puts it back to quantity on hand. And when we post the invoice, that's what takes it out of hand it takes it out of our system. So we're really recording all these transactions to both give you history and to calculate the current quantity on hand. Issuing a subassembly back to work in process, that also takes it out of on hand. So this is just a diagram to kind of understand what keeps it. And so I kind of have this double dotted dash line to basically show that when we're talking about inventory, it's not work in process. It's really the stuff that's on hand. It's both finished, purchased, or raw material goods combined. Usually there's different item types or groupings for that. When you're using the system, we usually encourage people to crawl, walk, run. I added a couple more categories today just to be obnoxious. I added speed, walk, and sprint. Okay. But your best utilization of the system is to start as simple as possible, to set up inventory, minimize the number of fields that you populate, fewer GL accounts, don't get overly complicated on how many different GL accounts tie to items. Maybe you're more focused on the purchased items, and you're really focused on on-hand tracking. So just doing the transactions that net you the quantity on hand. As you get better with the system and we populate more data into the system, like attributes, barcodes, different pricing levels, all of these are related to that inventory, tasks, minimum stocking levels, primary vendors. Again, you're populating more information into the system. You can get more out of the system because you put more in, but it did take some effort to put it in there. Speed walk is putting things like standard packaging or build min. You're also using more of the creating MOs, manufacturing orders, you're processing all that kind of stuff. You get to prioritize items or grouping them better. There's the reorder reports that help you suggest what you should buy. Lot control, again, a level of tracking to say this batch was made on this date and we sold it to Joe Schmo, on this date for traceability. Multiplier groups, that was like a pricing structure. You can keep adding more and more data to your inventory. Vendor cost, it's like you can enter your quote from the vendor. That one's a little bit takes a little more effort to where it comes in. You have to do the right click cross reference, enter vendor cost. And so then allows you to then put in for quantity, a set quantity, this is what our cost is. For another quantity, this is what our cost is. So it gives you that granularity in recording that. And it really comes in handy when you enter the purchase order. Primary customer, just association, who is that for? Bin location, again, how do you organize your warehouse and the inventory? And so you can start creating that structure and then assigning it to the items in there. More at the run level, we're into serial control, and that's a little more specific because that for every unit one, you're entering tracking information. So it's a higher level than just lot control. Drawing information, there's a whole tab within the item that you can add that, you can put more information on. MRP, we kind of mentioned that on the manufacturing thing, but will suggest based on transactions and current activity what you should buy and when. You can record manufacturers, not just the vendor that you should buy it, but maybe it's a 3M connector or it's a certain, specific brand that even if you buy it from multiple vendors, you can put that information in. Characteristics, that word is kind of generic. It's meant to be used in a generic fashion, whether it's like what kind of container you sell it in, can be a color, can it be, it's kind of meant to be open-ended, so you can ask us how creatively you can use that. Drop down lists for like projects, for entering the weight on items, so what's the, how much that shipment's going to weigh. Standard versus average costing, I briefly alluded to that earlier, where that's a kind of, you're really fine-tuning your costing because you're using a benchmark to compare what the actuals are, and you're updating both of them to get you better comparisons. Documents, we've talked about that in other seminars, as far as being able to just attach documents, whether it's MSDS sheets, whether it's specs, whether it's drawings, actual PDFs, things like that. And then there's internal notes to be able to just record history of what happened on this part, why is there a change, things like that. In the sprint, the high-end usage of the system, there's more details that you can get onto the item, including things like change control. That's under the quality module. Sales category, just to organize it better. Inspection criteria, you can make a whole list per item that you want it to be inspected to. And then there's another field called critical stock level, which is used in the reorder, which you can get a secondary warning. And that's used for like you have it on order, but they're late in getting it to you and you're running out. And so it'll warn you along that line. So again, our overview is don't try to swallow all of this at once. Progression, pick and choose which is appropriate for you and use in your facility. So how do you want to use it? So this is my open-ended for questions. And something maybe I skipped that you want me to show or explain on inventory. If we can keep the questions related to inventory, that'd be great. Just for the recording, we will have this available as a vlog later in a few days or something like that. So any questions I can answer for people, I'm going to switch to the program just so that if you ask me to go to a certain spot.
Hi, Claire. This is Marty from Moorpack.
Yeah.
If I have inventory in two separate bins in the same warehouse, is there a way for me to track the level on each different bin?
No, there's not. We did not, when we, it was kind of a decision we made many, many years ago that we would not track quantity at bin locations. So
Okay.
we just didn't go to that level of complexity. But what we do give you is the ability to add bins per warehouse as to what a number system is and is it the default for that warehouse, and then set an overall primary. So it's not going to tell you how many is in that bin, but it can tell you which is the primary bin to look in. And but yet the question is no, we don't track it at a bin quantity.
Okay. Thank
Great
you.
question.
Claire, one thing I'll mention is, or to let everybody know about, is on our website, technoerp.net, and the blog, there's, I think it's under tips and tricks too, but we did a blog on the item search menu that he showed up there in the top right corner and all the different ways you can use that. It's pretty versatile, and you can do and or type of logic or specific with quotes and all that. So if you're curious about that, there's a blog on it that shows you all the ways you can use that. And it's on almost every screen in the ERP now, so it's not just for items.
Good point. Other questions? You guys are gonna be too easy on me and not grill me on questions. I give Marty a compliment. That was a good question that's sometimes asked of us, and we just didn't choose to go to that level. Because when you do your physical counts, you do have to do those at a per warehouse level. And if you have lot tracking turned on, sometimes Marty, we've used that, but if you have lot tracking turned on, anytime you do, you're going to have it quantity on hand, and then you're going to have quantity per lot as well. So some of that information, it depends. And so the complexity went way up if you have the same lot in multiple bins and that kind of thing. And so that's why we chose not to do that.
No problem. I just have a few items that are like that, so it's
Yeah.
not that
Okay.
huge a deal.
Somebody bail Marty out. If not, he gets the sole gold star for the week, you know, for the question.
One point you made before, Claire, that I liked was a lot of, we see the tendency when people are setting up their GL to define their inventory in the GL. And we just want to remind you that, you know, all the reporting will give you the different dimensions like item type and warehouse. And you don't need a separate GL account for each type of your inventory. Sometimes we see that tendency to get overcomplicated.
Yeah, and that's along the lines of like old school, we'd put everything in the description. So much so that we kept having to grow the dimension of the description. I think we're up to 100 characters for the description now. It started out, I think, at 30 characters because people are like, I need to get that in the description. I need to get that. And there's so many more fields the information on. And as long as we modify the reports for you or something, that extra piece of information can flow to other places. Well, I hope this big picture wasn't too big picture for you all. Please feel free to email us for questions or future topics. I think we have a couple down for in the coming months, like the sales module that we'll be going over. And then we're going to go over some specific functions as well. But I appreciate everybody joining us today. We'll publish this in a few days. So thanks for everybody's time.